Hello there, as you can probably read from the title, we're going to be talking about Wayward lore book called The Fleshripper. Now, if you want to read the story yourself, just to get the context of what I'm going to be talking about, that'll be found in the description below. But before we get to reading it, I just want to talk about how I will be determining how good it is, or how bad it is. And my guidelines are, at least for lore books in general, is that they have to do three things. And those three things are, they have to tell us something about the world. Now, that means giving us information about the game world, or something that is a part of it. So when we read it, we understand a place, location, faction, and we know it's a part of the world. And then the second point is that place, character, faction, or idea is actually something that we will see in-game. We will actually interact with it in some way. And they are related, but again, you can have a lore book that talks about some foreign distant land that we don't really get to see or interact with, but you can have a character we get to read about and then we get to meet later on. Then the third point is a fairly subjective one. How good is the story actually? Now, to me, how I determine how good a story is a very baseline, which is if it accomplishes what it sets out to do. Now, with that done, how does the Fleshripper do 1.1? It does fine, but also not really at the same time. And so essentially, here's the thing. We get a lot of information regarding the seas of the archipelago, like encountering pirates, so we get to understand that it is a bit lawless, you know? And we get an idea that merchants and trading vessels are a big part of this, you know, from nation to nation trading with each other. Since this is a archipelago, a lot of ship travel will be involved. But similar to the Rejected lore book that we talked about before, it is on a very narrow topic as it focuses on a character and a ship, Captain Lino and the Fancy Lass. And that's not necessarily bad, but it doesn't give us a lot of information on the world as a whole. It gives us a lot of information on a character and related topics on that character. Now, as I said before, it doesn't really give a lot of information because it doesn't answer questions like how does travel by sea work, how safe it is, what nations control the seas the most. It doesn't really answer those questions. But it was also something I have to note is the relationship to Daggerfall. Now, Daggerfall has a sea. It is the Iliac Bay, and is a huge component of fast travel from going place to place. You can take the roads or the ships, which can cut down your travel time really quickly. But in Daggerfall, as I said before, it just serves those functions. But what it didn't serve is it didn't serve ship combat, which with the Fleshripper seems like it's actually focusing on ship combat as it's a very big focal point, but that's not necessarily something that I think is going to be in the Wayward Realms, but I'll get to that point when I get to point 2. So let's talk about the indirect information we get from this story. So we got newer stuff instead of like a lot of repeating names like the god Aeus. We get names like Splendor, from my understanding, a port city. We get Cloutshire Silk, which is a silk, but what we also get is that Cloutshire is probably a location for a place called Cloutshire, like Chinese silk is a silk from China. And then we get Taivin, which is a location that the Captain Lino is going to, because that's where he's going to get his hole. And then we got also the name of Fleshripper, which is the name of the sword that you can see from the top here. And that's also important to know because we get some information on special items in the Wayward Realms. Now on to the point 2. So, to get this out of the way, the ship in Daggerfall that you could buy couldn't do a lot of things. You could climb aboard the ship and look around, but nothing much else. But the story suggests that there are a lot more to do with ships than just player housing. Perhaps the player can engage in sea battles, either work for a faction to stop pirates and raiders, or become a pirate and take the loot aboard unlucky ships. But I'm hesitant to say that the ships will be more than they were in Daggerfall, not because I think the team won't make it, but simply because to do what is suggested in the lore book would take a lot of time that could be better spent elsewhere. When Daggerfall released, the ship was a cool house you can get in and like store some stuff if you want, but mechanically it ended there. It was very featureless, and because you had no crew, it was permanently stuck in one location, and nothing much else. Expectations on what ships should look like and ship combat have also drastically risen. You can't just have what Daggerfall had, which was just a very plain wooden ship with no real details and literally no crew on it. You have to have more than that. To the point, and this expectation that has risen has caused a bit of a negative, you could view it that way, a consequence to the point where ship combat sort of takes over large chunks of the game. Newer Assassin's Creed games, for example, has the player spend a good portion of their playtime just on a ship. Now, whether that is for the main quest or side quest, but you may say that those games are fine with ship combat, so why can't the Wayward Realms do that? Well, because those games had a limit to how many ship battles you could do. There was a finite amount that you could have in Assassin's Creed. There was only so many. Daggerfall doesn't really have that, and Wayward Realms is going to be similar to that, with having radiant quests. You can take on as many side quests as you want, and you'll never run out of side content to do. That would, in my mind, apply to the ships as well. You would have to repeat a very similar process from ship battles, with no real new mechanical additions whatsoever. You could probably have better tiers of ships, but eventually that you'll reach that tier, and when you reach that tier, there's nothing else really for you to do. And additionally, ship combat is so different from the regular flow of combat that it'll feel a lot more exhausting to do, and it'll feel a lot more, how do you say, it deviates from that flow of combat a lot more. Now again, they could add it, and they could do everything that I just said about how ships could act in the Wayward Realms, but to me, I don't think that it's going to be a likelihood that it's going to happen, because it's such a lot of time and development to do it, but also it may, in reality, interrupt the flow of normal gameplay a bit too much. Now, what about the other things, such as Fleshripper? Now, in the story, it's a very powerful sword. We see that the captain who's against Captain Lino just cleaves off so many people, and when Captain Lino actually gets it, he just cleaves off a lot of other people, so we can actually see it's very powerful. And it just confirms the fact that special quest items which have special unique effects will actually happen, will be something the player can attain, and that's really cool. Now, overall, I think the lore book does, on point 2 at least, fine depending on how you think of the ship. If you think the ship isn't going to really be a thing in the Wayward Realms, it's going to do very poorly, because all this has really done is, yeah, artifacts happen, artifacts exist, which you could already kind of think that artifacts would exist in Wayward Realms, because it was in Daggerfall, and since Wayward Realms is a spiritual successor to Daggerfall, it normally just applies from one to another. But now let's go on to the third point, which is how good is it? Now this is where you can see the book is a lot more focused on. It's a lot more focused on writing a really good story rather than telling us anything about the world, which is definitely fine. I don't necessarily mind that. So the book serves, as I said before, not really as a showcase of mechanics, but more on just telling a good story. It is a pirate adventure starring Captain Lino and the fancy knight's crew, where all the expected hijinks of a pirate adventure takes place. Lots of jokes, witty banter, the third-person narration portrays the story less as a serious battle and more of another chapter in their lives. You just turn the page and, oh, they took a massive hole and now they're in danger and now they're going to die, but they're not going to die. It's wacky and wild, you know. Plundered a massive hole, excitedly going through all their pickings out what they want, but then gasps suddenly, privateers are now looking to plunder what they plundered, and as a respectable man, Captain Lino takes off his pants and moons them. He then taunts them for missing their cannon shots, but when he is forced to fight, he fights it head on with the adventure in his heart and no dread whatsoever. The opposing captain, and he head on fights him, but luckily for him, the blood that's smeared onto his ship allows him to slide on over, which the opposing captain did not expect, allowing him to gut him and then just kill him outright. He then takes his sword Fleshripper and he just kills the rest of the other crew. With another ship in hand, he sails off to sell it to anyone who wants to. Now, this is again very high toned, a very bright tone compared to the previous lore books, which were a lot more depressing. And again, this is a very heavy departure from that. And that's not necessarily bad, because to me it allows the writers to have more variance to how they want to write their stories. But I think it has to be pointed out that there has to be a proportion of grim and fun, because adding too much fun would kind of remove the point of the Wayward Realms is trying to do, and having too much grim kind of makes it feel less worthwhile. So there has to be a good proportional amount of these two types. And again, it gives the world a lot more depth if it has at least some fun in it. And yeah, not a lot about this book I think really adds much to the world building, because a lot of it you can kind of infer that can have it in the, that could be transferred from Daggerfall to the Wayward Realms. But overall, I still think it's a really good book, because it focuses on writing a really good story and does it really well. I think it's a really good addition to the Wayward Realms. And if you enjoyed it, I'm glad. If you want to talk about it, comments down below.